Welcome. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad. So glad that you can spend some time with us today. Today we're going to reflect upon a passage of Scripture where Jesus really warned us about slipping into self-righteousness and being judgmental. We're looking at a passage, a parable from Luke, the 18th chapter, verses 9 through 14. And many people call this the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. At verse 9. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like that tax collector right here. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, on the other hand, standing afar off, would not even look up to heaven. He was beating his chest and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified, rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. The Pharisees were people who were very serious about following God. Often they were the ones who were debating with Jesus in the different stories that they were studying and trying to figure out what it meant to do things right, what it meant to follow God. And this is a guy who really felt like he had gotten it right. He was doing a lot of the things. He was being righteous in his own eyes. You know, he was leading a moral life. He was religiously observant. He was financially generous with everything that was going on. But one of the things that happened is that he had become self-righteous, and he felt comfortable looking down on other people and looking down on this tax collector. Now, in the Jewish society in Israel at this time period, a tax collector held a special place of contempt in that society, because the tax collector was working for the Romans. And we remember that the Romans were an occupying army, an occupying force who had conquered Israel and in many ways was exploiting them and directing them. So by someone who was willingly working for the Romans, particularly as a tax collector, as someone who was betraying their own people, tax collectors also made a portion of made their income by keeping a portion of the taxes that they collected, in some ways as a type of commission or bounty, but they were responsible to collect a certain amount of money and turn it into Rome. So the whole idea that this is a guy who made his money, made his income, taking money from his own people and sending it to Rome, he had a special place of contempt in the society. And the Pharisee felt so comfortable looking down on him, so comfortable judging him, so comfortable condemning him, that he was even willing to call him out by name in his prayers. You know, one of the challenges that happens when we compare ourselves to others is that we have to understand that the other people are not our standard. The other people are not our standard. God is our standard. And the vision that God has for us is our standard. By that account, and by those accounts, all of us fall short. All of us are still have work to do. All of us are works in progress. All of us are still working, still growing, still striving. A little bit later in this passage, there's actually a person who comes up to Jesus and calls him good teacher. And Jesus actually replied back, why do you call me good? There's no one good but God alone. In other words, you see the humility that Jesus had. The humility that Jesus had, not to allow himself to be called good, because Jesus wanted us to focus on the higher standard, the standard that God has for us. When we get so comfortable with our own self-righteousness that we're doing the right things, sometimes that allows us to slip into contempt. It allows us to slip into judgmentalism. How many of us have struggled with this? I know I have. How many of us struggle with this today? I know I do. We could take so many things, even if it's this current pandemic in which we find ourselves. There's so many of us that are working so hard to do everything that we can to minimize, the consequences of this. We've gotten vaccinated. We wear our mask. We use sanitizer when possible, and when life allows, we socially distant. And then we look at other people, and we sometimes feel like they're being so reckless and irresponsible and so callous and that sort of thing. There's a level of righteousness. Oh, but how often do we? How often do I? We, if you can identify with this, go from the idea of being righteous and trying to do the right things to crossing over the boundary to where we start looking down on them. What's wrong with them? They're so. That's my struggle. If it's not your struggle, you go ahead. But it's not a matter of looking down on other people. It's not a matter of looking in the mirror and praising ourselves and looking out the window and condemning others. But it's a matter of always being faithful. The title of this message is to stay humble, pray humble. That we want to pray humbly. Because here's the secret: is many of us may have come to places of righteousness in some areas of our life. Some of us may have some things that are going well and that we're doing well in many areas of our life. This Pharisee was doing a really good job in many ways. He was living a moral life. He was generous. He was religiously observant. But again, he had lost the plot. He had lost the plot. He had become so confident of his own righteousness that he was no longer humble enough to allow God to guide him, to allow scriptures to guide him. He was so confident of his own righteousness that he had hardened his heart. He had hardened his heart, and so he had no caring, no compassion. He had nothing but contempt when he looked on his neighbor, the same person that was just praying maybe a few feet away from him. He looked upon that person with contempt. There was no idea of connection. There was no love. There was no regard. It's so important for us. It's so important for us not to slip into self-righteousness. I believe that that's actually a challenge with our time. We're a very polarized society right now. We're a very polarized world. We get to our respective camps, and we pump ourselves up. We talk about all the good things that we are doing, and we talk about all the bad things that the other folks are doing. Where we are the good people, they are the bad people. We are the faithful, they are the sinners. And sometimes we have no regard for the ways that we fall short, for the ways where we need to grow. Our neighbors are not the standard, and we're not to compare ourselves to them. There was a psalmist that had written that all of our righteousness was nothing but filthy rags. God is the standard. There's no one good but God. And so we always want to compare ourselves to God and what God would have us do, to the type of love that God would want us to have, to the type of service that God would want us to do, to the type of care and empathy that God would want us to have, and compassion, the way that we seek and long for justice, the way God seeks and longs for justice and desires that. That's the standard. Our neighbor is not the standard. And by that standard, we always need to pray in humility. Because an honest look at ourselves, an honest look at the mirror, as opposed to looking out the window, will show us the areas in which we need to grow. An honest look at ourselves in the mirror and comparing ourselves to the standard of God will show us where we have an opportunity to grow, to become more loving, to become more faithful, to become more nurturing. But when we focus on other people, when we look at what they're not doing and grade ourselves that way, when we grade ourselves on a curve rather than by an absolute standard, it allows us to take undue pride in ourselves and to become arrogant and to become judgmental. Brothers and sisters, just as this Pharisee, we want to look at ourselves and make sure that we haven't become that person, that super holy Christian, that judgmental Christian, that judgmental follower of God that's looking down on others, looking at them with contempt, being dismissive of them, and really boosting ourselves up and patting ourselves on the back. Because someone who's humble before God is being heard by God. God isn't hearing our righteousness. Stay humble. Pray humble. Peace be with you.